Father in heaven, we find ourselves called to your place of worship this afternoon. Grateful for the opportunity to be together. Grateful for your word. Grateful for the chance to let your Spirit work. Father, more than anything, that's what we ask for, is that your Spirit dwell richly here and that your truth will be made known to us. We love you, Lord. Amen. So, the last time I was here for a worship hour, I got to introduce you to someone. Sergeant Danny Crane, right? We liked Danny Crane at first. We didn't end up liking Danny Crane so much when it was over, right? Can I introduce you to someone else? That's him. His name is Chiune Sugihara. But everyone called him Sempo. That was his nickname. When I first came across Sugihara's story, and this has been a number of years, I wasn't sure I believed it. Because it sounded to me like some kind of fish tale, right? Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett or some story that was based in some truth, but it was exaggerated. Had to be, beyond all proportions, by people needing a hero. I researched it further. I was able to corroborate the story. Multiple sources. The principal one being the Holocaust Memorial website. Big study was done on him by Stanford. Articles, you can find him. He's actually fairly well known now. Right? So I became a believer and an admirer. Can you all see from that side? It was 1940 in the small country of Lithuania in Eastern Europe. Western Europe was embroiled in the early 40s in World War II. And Sempo Sugihara was a career Japanese diplomat. And he was assigned to Kaunas, the capital at that time of Lithuania. It's no longer the capital, Vilnius is, but at that time, Kaunas was the capital of Lithuania, and that's where Sugihara was sent to staff a one-man Japanese consulate in Kaunas. And while Sempo wasn't really a spy per se, his title was a cover for his real duties, which were to report to Japan on Russian and German troop movements. You know, sometime prior to this assignment, Sugihara had converted from the traditional ancestor worship of Japan to Christianity. He'd done that not while in Japan, but while serving in Manchuria. It's curious to me that we have a Japanese man being brought to belief in Messiah while in China. And now, many years and many hundreds of miles later, miles away, Sugihara's belief was about to be put to the test. Sugihara had been in Lithuania only a few months in June of 1940 when Germany invaded Poland, resulting in this wave of Jewish refugees pouring north out of Poland into Lithuania. They were seeking to escape deportation and death at the hands of the Nazis. You know that even recently, Poland has been very much in the news about how they, deal with the reality of the Holocaust in that land. So here the Jews were rushing out of Poland into Lithuania to escape the Nazis. And to add to the desperate situation, Russian troops rolled in from the east. And they annexed Lithuania in July. They toppled the government. They ordered all the foreign embassies closed. And nearly all countries complied. The consulates closed their doors, and the envoys returning safely home, obeying orders and getting out of harm's way. There were only 2 consuls that applied for permission to stay on a little longer: the Netherlands and Japan. And Sugihara was granted only 3 weeks to close up shop. 3 weeks. And hundreds of Jewish people whose lives hung in the balance. You see, the Nazis were behind them, blocking their passage west. The Soviet occupation of Lithuania provided no security, and the Jewish people had nowhere to run except east, through Russia, and no one to turn to except these 2 remaining consulates. Russia, no friend to the Jews, would not accept the refugees. Russia would not accept the refugees, but they would allow them passage by train through Siberia on 2 conditions. First, they had to pay 5 times the going rate for the fare. 5 times. And 2, they must have a visa from the country to which they were traveling. But no country would give them a visa. We said there were 2 consulates that remained open. Who was the other one? Enter the Dutch. For a fee, the Dutch consul could grant the refugees entry into, get this, Suriname and Curacao. 2 Dutch colonies where? In South America. These Jewish refugees had never heard of these far-off places. But here was their opportunity. If Japan would grant them 10-day transit visas, not entry visas, not permanent visas, not work visas, just 10-day transit visas, the Jewish refugees could, theoretically, take the train from Kaunas, go all the way across Siberia to Vladivostok, pass through Japan, and set sail for freedom in South America. Waking to find hundreds of Jewish refugees camped outside his door, Sugihara cabled his superiors for permission to issue the transit visas. Permission denied. 3 times Sugihara asked Tokyo to allow him to grant the visas. The 3rd time, the cable came back. Concerning transit visas previously requested, stop. Advise absolutely not to be issued to any traveler not holding firm end visa with guaranteed departure from Japan. Stop. No exceptions. Stop. No further inquiries expected. Stop. Transmission over. Permission denied. At this point, Sugihara has a choice to make. And the choice very well could have been It's too big a problem, and it isn't mine. I have a direct order to not do this. If I defy orders and do so, I will lose my career in disgrace. I'll be unable to support my wife and children. Therefore, I'll close the doors. I will have served my country honorably. I will have personal security in these troubled times. He could have said, they're my enemy. Remember, Germany and Japan, the original axis of evil. But as a believer, Sempo knew that God the Father is not the enemy of my enemies. God isn't even the enemy of his own enemies. So instead, after discussing the matter with his wife, Sugihara chose to protect lives instead of his livelihood. He defied the orders of his superiors, and he began issuing transit visas. I told you I had trouble believing this story. And part of my reluctance was I worked for a Japanese company for most of my career. For over 20 years, I worked every day with Japanese colleagues, and I never once saw them defy an order from a superior. It just doesn't happen. It's not done. A Japanese employee may vehemently disagree with a superior's decision, but he will comply. But Sugihara didn't comply. Instead, for 29 days, he hand-wrote visas in triplicate as fast as he could, 18 to 20 hours a day, not stopping to eat a proper meal. He wrote more visas in a day than would normally be written in a month. His wife, Yukiko, would massage his hand and ice his shoulder just to keep him going. And when the authorities came and they closed the consulate, Sugihara kept right on writing visas to the very last moment. While on the train, waiting to pull out of the station, he was still stamping visas and throwing them out the window. And some say that as the train pulled away, he threw his stamp out into the crowd. Permission granted. To date, over 2,000 visas have been found bearing Sugihara's stamp. And most of those were to heads of families, which allowed the entire family passage and escape. Estimates are that 6,000 to 10,000 refugees owed their lives to Chiune Sugihara. And now here we are, 2 generations later. And 40,000 to 50,000 people can trace their very lives to Sempo's choice. Sugihara did lose his job, his livelihood, and his position in society. Never worked for the government again. He took odd jobs to support his family during and after the war, and he eventually became a middle manager for some trading company. He was a humble man. He never spoke about what he'd done or the lives he'd saved. In fact, it wasn't until 1969, nearly 30 years later, that one of the survivors found him. And soon many more were telling the story of Sempo Sugihara's compassion. Ultimately, the stories were investigated by a commission of the Israeli Supreme Court. And it was true. And the state of Israel did what they could in 1985. In 1985, They named Sugihara, listen to this, righteous among the nations. They named him a righteous Gentile. The highest honor that could be given to a non-Jew. By that time, at 85 years old, he was too frail and he was too sick to travel. He never did see Israel. Never sat in the park in Jerusalem named in his honor. Sempo died July 31, 1986. 46 years to the day he made his choice and picked up his pen. I can tell you that it's customary for the Japanese when they come to this country, my coworkers, my colleagues, to take on an American name because it's easier to pronounce for us, and they believe it helps them fit in. And this is why I have Japanese coworkers named Ken and Sean and Mac. Right? Ken, recently, or he named his American-born daughter Cookie. Yeah. Cookie Imamura. Now, back in 1985, when Sugihara was named righteous among the nations, he was offered the privilege which comes with this honor: Israeli citizenship and a pension. He chose not to accept them. But I'd like to think that if he had, if Sempo had moved to Israel, then perhaps he might have chosen a Hebrew name. And in my opinion, that name should have been Oded. 2 Chronicles 28. 2 Chronicles 28 tells us of an episode during the time of the divided kingdom, Israel and Judah. Ahaz sits on the throne in Jerusalem, a wicked king in Judah. Reading from the beginning of the chapter. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. Unlike David, his father, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, and also made cast idols for worshiping the Baals. He burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom and sacrificed his sons in the fire, following the detestable ways of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the high places, on the hilltops, and under every spreading tree. Worshipped Baal, made idols, child sacrifice, and generally acted like the Canaanites they were supposed to have rejected. The northern kingdom of Israel, under Pekah, fought and defeated Ahaz. Right? Verse 6, the end of verse 5. He, meaning Ahaz, was also given into the hands of the king of Israel, who inflicted heavy casualties on him. In one day, Pekah, son of Remaliah, killed 120,000 soldiers in Judah, because Judah had forsaken the Lord. So the northern kingdom of Israel, under Pekah, fought and defeated Ahaz. But was the victory won on their merits? What did the verse tell us? Was Pekah stronger, better equipped, better trained? Did Israel have better strategies or smarter commanders? No. Verse 6, Pekah, son of Remaliah, killed 120,000 soldiers in Judah. Why? Because Judah had forsaken the Lord. The Bible makes it very clear. He had forsaken the God of their fathers. God had removed his protection from Judah. And as the commentary points out, when the protection of the Lord is withdrawn, man discovers to his sorrow that the master he has chosen can be exceedingly cruel. In fact, verse 7, Zikri, an Ephraimite warrior, killed Maaseiah the king's son. Azrikam, the officer in charge of the palace, and Elkanah, second to the king. He lost all three of those. His son, his second in command, and the officer in charge of the palace. Down to verse 8. The Israelites took captive from their kinsmen 200,000 wives, sons, and daughters. They also took a great deal of plunder, which they carried back to Samaria. What an army! Pekah's soldiers had defeated 120,000 of what the King James calls Judah's valiant men. And now they were leading a procession of captives. How many? 200,000 of them. 200,000 of the saddest, most hopeless, most bedraggled boys, girls, and women that you can imagine. It was a trail of tears. The men are all dead. Who are these people? They are the wives and children who were left after the battle. Widows and orphans. They're hopeless because there are no husbands, brothers, uncles, or fathers left to come and rescue them. Widows and orphans, the very people God the Father had instructed his children to protect. So what do you think? 250,000 people? 200,000 captives and 50,000 soldiers? Well, maybe, right? They killed 120,000. Call it 50. Exulting in their triumph. Fevered with victory. Celebrating their spoils. Thinking about dividing the plunder. More hands to add to the workforce, and hey, more slave girls. Can't you just picture their swagger as they approach the gates of their capital city of Samaria? It's likely that most of the inhabitants of the city turned out to greet their returning heroes and husbands. Everyone's excited about the victory. The whole town is abuzz. The dignitaries in the front, ready to welcome and praise the troops. We're going to have us a regular ticker tape parade. But verse 9. Something's going to happen here. But a prophet of the Lord named Oded was there. Oded looked at this procession. He didn't see riches and spoils of war. He didn't see plunder. You know what Oded saw? He saw his brethren. He knew what the soldiers were planning, and he knew it was wrong. The Father had clearly instructed in Leviticus that his people were not to be slaves. Leviticus 25, but over your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with vigor. You are not to forcibly enslave your brother. And if thy brother wax poor and sell himself unto the stranger, meaning if he sells himself into slavery, after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brethren may redeem him. We're not called to enslave. We're called to redeem. But a prophet of the Lord named Oded was there, and he went out to meet the army when it returned to Samaria. He said to them, because the Lord, the God of your fathers, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. But you have slaughtered them in a rage that reaches to heaven. And now you intend to make the men and women of Judah and Jerusalem your slaves. But aren't you also guilty of sins against the Lord your God? He's saying, can't you understand that there but by the grace of God go us? And verse 11 reads, now listen to me. Send back your fellow countrymen. Send back your fellow countrymen you have taken as prisoners, for the Lord's fierce anger rests on you. That's it. All we know of Oded is in these 3 verses, and in one other reference that mentions his son later. That's all. 3 verses, and he's gone. But in those 3 verses, Oded takes a stand. We're all of a generation that we remember Tiananmen Square. And one lone Chinese man standing in front of a line of tanks. That man stood before the powerful military of his own country and said, this cannot proceed. Oded may be the Bible's first activist. He personally stood to gain nothing. And he was risking everything. In modern terms, we might say that Oded was to the Jerusalem captives what sort of the white civil rights workers were in our own country. They weren't part of the oppressed. They didn't stand to gain anything. They risked it all, much like Sugihara. Oded looked at the long line of captives and the triumphant soldiers. He saw the cheering crowd. Oded knew that a great sin was about to be committed, an evil which could not be easily undone. Once the captive children were separated from their mothers, once the prisoners had been sent to sundry parts of the kingdom, once the women had been taken, there would be no way to make this wrong right. Oded had just moments in which to make his choice. And like Sugihara, Oded could have said, it's too big, it's not my problem, I'll risk my reputation, my influence, my standing in this society. With all these soldiers around here, I may even be risking my life. Oded looks around. He's in the middle of a crowd. He's looking at the leaders, the diplomats there in the front. Is someone going to stop this? Don't they know how wrong this is? But in the faces around him, he sees no reflection of his internal conflict. So Oded makes his choice. He steps out of the comfort and the complacency of the crowd, swallows hard, and prophesies. He speaks forth the word of the Lord. Now listen to me. Send back your fellow countrymen, your brethren you've taken as prisoners, for the Lord's fierce anger rests on you. How do you think that went over? What did he say? Who is he? He better not be talking about us right now. And you know what? Before the crowd could recover from its shock at Oded's audacity, Before the soldiers could reach for their swords, 4 other voices chime in. Verse 12. Then some of the leaders in Ephraim, Azariah, son of Jehohanan, Berechiah, son of Meshillemoth, Jehizkiah, son of Shallum, and Amasa, son of Hadlai, confronted those who were arriving from the war. You must not bring those prisoners here, they said, or we will be guilty before the Lord. Do you intend to add to our sin and guilt? For our guilt is already great, and his fierce anger rests on Israel. The soldiers had been proud. Hadn't they just won a great victory? Didn't that mean God was with them? What do you mean his fierce anger rests on Israel? We're having success in our life. Doesn't that mean we're living under God's blessing? How do you reconcile that? Well, just as suffering in this life doesn't necessarily mean God is punishing you, success in this life does not indicate his favor. Yes, the soldiers were successful, and no, God was not pleased with them. Yes, Israel was victorious over Judah, and no, God was not pleased. But God always has a remnant. Those who still value his laws and listen to his voice, and often there are more of them than is apparent. Oded, like Elijah before him, may have felt he was the only faithful one left. But God said, oh no, I've got more in Israel who are faithful to me. And the princes spoke. You know, at first, I was pretty hard on these 4 princes. Oh, sure. Wait till Oded stands out there and says something, and then you get your courage. I bet if Oded doesn't say anything, you don't either. But as it was pointed out to me, that's not fair. Because our Father in his grace gives us many chances to do what's right. It is true. Oded did speak first. And there is great virtue in being the one with enough faith, because that's what it takes to speak out alone. But the princes deserve credit too. They may not have answered God's call on their hearts the first time, but the next time they had an opportunity to respond in righteousness, they did. Do not beat yourself up over lost opportunities. Many times God calls. We hear his voice. We don't know what to do about it. We don't see our way clear. We don't understand it. Our faith is too weak. The examples around us are too poor. And we just let God's call go unanswered in our lives, vaguely conscious of missing out on something, unsure of what even it was. But if we continue striving, struggling to understand the mystery of God in our lives, he will bring that call around again. And there is still great virtue and great reward in answering his call the second time. Because Oded and the 4 princes spoke up, we see in verse 14, so the soldiers gave up the prisoners and plunder in the presence of the officials and all the assembly. Ain't that just the way? When somebody calls out the bully, the fight breaks up, everybody goes home. The bullies disperse quickly. The soldiers just left. And the verse continues. 15, the men designated by name took the prisoners, and from the plunder they clothed all who were naked. They provided them with clothes and sandals, food and drink, and healing balm. All those who were weak, they put on donkeys. And so they took them back to their fellow countrymen at Jericho, the city of palms, and returned where? To Samaria. Clothed them, fed them, healed them, put them on a donkey, made sure they got home, and then went back to Samaria. Do you see it? Oded was the original Good Samaritan. When Yeshua told the parable of the Good Samaritan in response to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" And the story bears a striking resemblance to the story of Oded. Only in the New Testament version, the decisions and actions are all very personal. They're all very private. Nobody else sees. Oded, along with the princes of Ephraim, was a Samaritan who saw his brethren bruised and bleeding. And he saw to it that their wounds were dressed, their bodies clothed, and their needs attended to. Put the weak on donkeys, and he made sure they all got home. It was all very public. In the story that Jesus tells, it's a Jewish man attacked by robbers and left to die. And while the priest and then a Levite passed him by in order to not inconvenience themselves, it is a foreigner, a Samaritan, who recognized in that hurting Jewish man a kinsman. A man like himself in need of help. And he took the time, the inconvenience, and the expense to help this stranger. And he did it, even though no one would have ever known if he had simply passed the man by. He too could have said the man's needs were too great, they weren't his problem, and that he risked nothing by ignoring him. No one would have known. Nor would anyone have blamed him if he'd have simply minded his own business. In fact, no one would have known if he just kept walking. No one would have known if Oded had just kept quiet. No one would have known if Sugihara had just shut the doors. No one would have known that they had rejected the call God put on their hearts. But God would have. And he calls each of us to be righteous among the Gentiles. Today we think of being a good Samaritan, we think of helping someone change a flat. That's not what the story of the Good Samaritan is about. It's about seeing in one another our kinsmen, our brethren, and doing all we can to see them redeemed. It's about doing the righteous thing because it is righteous. That the Father might declare us each to be righteous among the nations is my prayer and our blessing for you.